Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So, I love the tone of my voice every single time. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about being a teenager, about why are the popular kids popular. It's all inspired by little bits and bobs, different videos I've been watching. I always say this, it's a slightly lighter topic, and then it ends up going really dark, like my poetry, but alas, I've titled this episode Popular, Pick Me, and the Teenage Experience. So, without further ado, let's get started. So the fated episode 13, if the moral dilemma's little bonus episode is a bonus, so it's like 12.5. So today we're going to be talking about the teenage experience, about how there always seems to be... It's funny because it tends to be that when you're an adult and when you're older, maybe parents, you look at teenagers. This is a very stereotyped view of parents, but you look at teenagers and the grumpy, the grouchy, and yeah, they may be. I mean, I'm only 21, and you look at teenagers, you're like, oh my god, teenagers. But also, I suppose you're somewhat socialised to look at teenagers through this sort of derogatory lens. But you go through so much during those ages. So 13 to 19, that is a massive swathe of time. That includes high school for the UK, sixth form, starting university if that's what you go to do, or starting in the workplace. This is a huge time for the development of a person, just generally. Throughout your entire life, this is probably how many years is it? This is like the 6 years where you're going to be changing the most. So it comes along with a lot of bodily changes as well as personality changes, life experiences. A lot happens during your teenager, so it's not surprising that it's a tough time. And I reflect on my teenagers, and obviously you're looked at things like, oh god, teenagers, But when you are a teenager, you feel quite demeaned, and I think sometimes you feel like you've been dismissed almost, which isn't very nice, and especially when you're incredibly emotionally vulnerable during those years, and you're trying to find your place in the world, and making all the mistakes, which we'll get onto. But yeah, you're told who to be, you're told what to do, you're told what you should aim for, you're brought into... You're trying to find yourself at the same time as everyone else, especially at school where everyone's you're thrown together with people the same age as you in the same area. You're almost forced to make friends, and it can become quite a stifling atmosphere. And obviously there's all the pressures of academics and the stress that children... generally, that teenagers face socially, emotionally, and then academically is crazy, and I think we should look at them with a bit more respect. Of course, everybody has their ups and downs, their downfalls and their positives, their pros and cons. So we'll get into a few little bits and bobs here. We're going to talk about popularity in school and teenage culture later on. But for now, and the idea of this linking to teenage experience will become clear as I progress, we're going to talk about the pick me. So pick me girls and pick me boys. So obviously by the actual title itself, girls and boys, this is a very, very gendered tropes, a very gendered stereotypes. In their TED Talk, Gabrielle Burton talks about gender fluidity, and Burton discusses the idea that when you are teenagers, or as soon as you are born, you are split into these distinct gender camps. So blue for boys, pink for girls. And in this way, they are given these almost direct route in life and things to be like, to like, to dislike, to aim for, and they are socialised as male or female. And now, of course, gender is more of a spectrum than it is traditionally thought to be. And I find it quite interesting that, this thing, pick me girls, pick me boys, it's a very belittling phrase because of girls, boys, and it shows an almost naivety to the trope itself, and the naivety that goes alongside fulfilling one of these tropes, perhaps. But it is also a demeaning label, because ultimately a pick-me isn't necessarily going to label themselves a pick-me. It's other people who label them pick-me in a negative lighting. The phrase pick-me is, it sounds very selfish, it sounds very babyish, it sounds very childish, immature. And that is because the people looking at the people who act like this see them as immature. So what is a pick-me girl and what is a pick-me boy? So pick-me girls, or the female pick-me, is a blend of alternative culture, so not like the other girls. So in their video, Khadija Bow talks about the fact that the pick-me is a new iteration of the not like the other girls trope. It's the evolution of this sort of alternative, more male friends than female friends, the idea that she's one of the boys, but she's also sexualized, so she's still distinctly feminine. It's a blend of this and classical female gender roles, which is interesting. So the pick-me is sort of a mashup of typical gender roles and also the obstruction of these roles and the way that they're acting more masculine, which in essence separates them from the feminine, which are the disfavoured traits, and therefore they can boost their standing in society, but they are still sexualized as women. By taking on masculine traits and masculine tropes per se, the demeanour of the tomboy, the not like the other girls girl, by also being derogatory against more feminine people, and that is internalised misogyny. Bow goes on to talk about how the pick-me puts down other women, a mix of the not like the other girls and the girl boss. So the girl boss being the very feminine, woman in power, we hate men, or the man hate 2010 era, we're not proud of this, female agency sort of thing. Now, the difference between the not like the other girls and the pick-me girls is that the pick-me girl takes on much more traditional feminine gender roles, traditional aesthetic. So we're thinking pinks, we're thinking clean, there's a bit of the clean girl in there maybe. Women in the home, internalising the male gaze, and they perpetuate this or try and force this on other people by putting down other women. They seek validation from men in a group setting, and they're very much focused on what women should be, and there's more focus on what women should be than the needs and wants of individual women. So Bo mentions the pro-life movement, the idea that the focus is on what women should do, have the baby, rear children, and not the needs of the individual woman who is pregnant and may, for all manner of reasons, desire or need an abortion. Now, coming back to teenagehood, it's seen time and again more with the not like the other girls trope, but the pick-me can come into it. However, the pick-me seems to be more of an adult woman trope. But because I think as time has gone on, the boundary per se between teenager and adult has blurred so much that, it's an endless cycle. It's a tale as old as time that teenagers will act like they're adults and fully, think that they're adults and think they know everything and blah, blah, blah. It's just how it is, because ultimately they desire to, their role models are adults. They, especially now, look at social media, and with the inception of social media, adulthood almost seems to precede 18 now. So during your teenagers, you're talking about women or people socialised as female, they see throughout their life that being a woman is a weakness. And in things like the not like the other girls trope, they can step away from these traditional feminine traits or appearances. Becoming a pick-me can also be a form of rebellion or anger. So while accepting these traditional gender roles, perhaps some women convince themselves that they are in turn abrupting the not like the other girls trope. It's kind of cycling back the other way. It's going to the other extreme. Like body and then the desirable body and the body goals and the most desirable figure, it's bouncing back and forth. And so it became about putting other women down, but from a very feminine, ultra feminine perspective, rather than a masculinized female figure. And the whole not like the girls stepping away from, I hate pink, I hate flowers. I definitely fell into this when I was in high school. I got in with the alternative crowd because I guess that's kind of what I thought I should be doing. I mean, so far as it could be said that they were the alternative crowd, but interestingly enough, my love of alternative music has come from my dad as much as them, but it's kind of, I started listening to people like Fall Out Boy, my emo era, that started while I was hanging out with them because I basically told Little White Lie and said that I like that music as well, and that's how I ended up in the group. Well, that wasn't how I ended up in the group, but it's part of me feeling like I belonged in the group because I like that music, and it's particular people that I latched to, and I don't really know why. I guess I liked them, or they seemed liked by other people, so you kind of feel like, oh, if I act like them, or if I like the things that they like, then I can be embraced and accepted. But yeah, I developed an aversion to pink, to florals, and my dislike wasn't genuine. I enforced it onto myself in order to fit in with who I thought I should know. But time has proven again and again that if you're simply yourself, you will find the right people. And I have done, and my aversion to pink and flowers well unsubsided. And now I can kind of do whatever I want. Sometimes I wear pink, sometimes I wear flowers. I quite like flowers. You know what? I do like flowers. I like pink, but I also like black and playing the bass. I don't have to be feminine or alternative. I could be a bit of both, and that's the whole point. People are spectrums. Nobody can rigidly fit into these stereotypes. Linking to this, Mina Lay, in her video on the hyper-feminine aesthetic, she goes on to talk about Bimbo Core. A bimbo is essentially, think blonde, ignorant, beautiful, the classical sort of mean girl. The not like the other girls is contrasted directly with this hyper-feminine stereotype. And it's interesting with the resurgence of Bimbo Core in recent years, because Mina says that everything a woman does is looked at through a political lens, and it really is. So if a woman wears all pink and dyes her hair blonde, she's seen as either abrupting the patriarchy because she's embracing it and she's doing it because she loves it, or she's going along with the patriarchy and can be booed at by all feminists. You can't be free, but you do suppress femininity in your teenagehood, because embracing femininity seems a bad thing. You're socialized as feminine, but then you're told that feminine equals bad, so you're automatically placed in a lower position. So no wonder a lot of girls in their teenage years feel the sense of dissatisfaction and feeling like they can't belong anywhere, and I can't act like that, I need to not wear pink because that's a bad thing, but then what if I like it, but then I've been told that I should like it because I'm a girl, and it's so confusing. It's a lot, and then you're trying to navigate making friends. Now, Jordan Teresa, in her video on Pick Me Boys and Nice Guys, Pick Me Boy is characterised by a few things that Jordan says, so casual misogyny. Pick Me Boys are also susceptible to incel culture. So Jordan talks about this sort of pick me to incel like pipeline, which was really interesting. I definitely recommend watching her video to look more into that. But the pick me is very self-deprecating. They kind of talk about how different they are compared to other men, and their self-deprecation is almost the way in which they flirt, which is interesting. The difference between Pick Me Boys and Pick Me Girls, they both sort of say how different they are to the others of their sex, and how they do these things and they're better because of this. But the Pick Me Boy does it in like a self-deprecating way to seem kind of like charming and a bit approachable, whereas for the Pick Me Girl, they do it in a very confrontational, not aggressive perhaps, so it could be aggressive, but kind of in quote marks like a bitchy way. It's very overt, and in that way it's really interesting because the Pick Me Boy being all quiet and self-deprecating and oh no, like poor little me, that's kind of a bit more of a classical feminine trope. Whereas pick-me girl, they're very overt, and they're even, like I said, aggressive. They're straightforward, they're confident in what they're saying, which is perhaps more of a stereotypically masculine trait. So again, it's that idea of stepping out of their gender to maybe seem more appealing to the opposite sex. But, as Billie Eilish says in Happier Than Ever, it always said you were misunderstood. And that really encapsulates the whole pick-me boy, nice guy sort of idea. Pick-me boys tend to catch feelings quickly and latch on to the woman of their desires in heterosexual relationships. They make a big act of being the superior man or the hero as well. So again, it's interesting here how both the pick-me girl and the pick-me boy are characterised as putting down women, as well as a layer of being better than other men for the pick-me boy. But you see that the pick-me boy goes for girls when they are emotionally vulnerable. So in both senses, their actions hurt those socialised as female. The pick-me girl fawns over men, per se. She doesn't hurt other men. The pick-me boy puts him down a bit, but it's not as hurtful as the pick-me girl putting down other women, because women are already in that lower place. And the pick-me boy is inherently, quote-unquote, vulnerable. And so while he makes a big act of being, like, superior or swooping in to be the hero, which is perhaps his big hurrah, and is a classical patriarchal action, he is not an aggressor. He uses this, which links into the nice guy act, because, as Jordan says about the nice guy, it's the bare minimum. So they think that being nice is enough, that for a flourishing romantic relationship, as long as they're not violent, or as long as they're not aggressive, then that's all good, and they're great men. So while the pick-me girl is greatly problematic due to its potential psychological effects on other women, as well as the perpetuation of casual misogyny, the pick-me boy is more vulnerable to becoming an aggravator and perpetrator of gender-based violence. And with the relationship dynamic, you don't realise when you're in it, because that person, that the man in this case, is the good one. They're nice, and a lot of people like them, even mutual friends. They really like them, and they think they're great. So you can't come to terms with the way that they make you feel, and you feel like maybe you're interpreting things wrong. And I feel like my previous experiences perhaps straddle the line between the nice guy and the pick-me. I think there's very subtle differences between the two. Perhaps we don't realise until we're in a romantic relationship with this person that they are the nice guy or the pick-me as well. It's in the close sphere that their true self comes to light, perhaps. I suppose what separates the nice guy from the pick-me, because the nice guy is also susceptible to radicalisation, for example, by incel culture. The basic social expectation of being nice to women as currency for sex as well. So treating women well and being the emotional support, that comes with expectations for physical intimacy. And if she doesn't treat him well, if she does a tiny little thing, she is berated for that. So there's that slight undercurrent of demeaning women. But what does separate the nice guy from the pick-me is the act of berating other men, and of the overt, aggressive or confrontational streak. So the nice guy doesn't berate other men, and the nice guy is also a much more subtle aggressor. And this perhaps makes them more dangerous, as their negative intent is more likely to be hid beneath the surface. Interestingly though, because of patriarchy, there is the possibility in some cases that being the nice guy is not actually intentional. Don't get me wrong, it's problematic either way, because you're essentially using the other person and using their trust. But many men may be susceptible, as they grow up, as they're going through their teenagers, and the boys around them have been told to act a certain way, and so they also feel like they have to act that certain way to fit in. They may be susceptible to problematic behaviour with any intimate partners, with those socialised as female being told that niceness equates to the best you can get. The idea that at least he isn't violent, and this can continue through generations. And especially during teenage years, I feel that males, they need to show their dominance. They're told that they need to show their hardness, their willing, their dominance, and this comes into the popularity question during things like high school, which you all come on to. But the characteristics of what makes a boy popular can feed into them becoming a nice guy or a pick-me boy. So as a little side note, the antithesis of the nice guy is the bad boy, and there's bad boys in high school as well. And in a video from The Take, they talk about the characteristics of the stereotypical bad boy. The strong, silent type, his morals are on his own terms, but in the end he is a cliche. And the idea that the girl comes along and tries to fix him. And while crushes, hypothetical crushes on characters in film and books, even TV shows, frequently heterosexual crushes from women to men are on like these sort of bad boy, bad guy. I mean, there is a key difference between a bad boy and a bad guy. Let's get real. And they get away with being bad due to their attractiveness. They offer a fantasy of making the wrong choice. It's a transgression as such, in The Take's words. But what the bad boy archetype does do is it encourages toxic masculinity. It encourages this maltreatment of those you become intimate with, really. But by seeing these tropes and seeing how women speak about these characters, men feel this is how they have to act because of the myth that women prefer bad boys. And as The Takes say, there is a statistic, but I can't quite remember, so apologies. But it's actually been proven that women don't, if there was a poll perhaps, women don't tend to actually end up with the bad boy per se. So it is really a myth. And I mean, I don't really know how this experiment how they kind of came to this statistic, but still, it's, yeah, you can't set up with a bad boy. It's interesting to talk about, obviously there is very overt and very clear stereotypes of women, but it's interesting to look at the stereotypes of men as well, and how all of these things can interplay when you are a teenager searching for an identity. Continuing, we're going to talk about the popular kids, and this whole episode is inspired by a video by a YouTuber called Scholar, and she was talking about trend cycling and fatphobia. And this is a massive thing in teenhood. I feel like one becomes much more aware of their appearance during their teenage years, and you are judged, and teens are ruthless, and people will say things that when they're older they think, oh gosh, why did I say that? A lot of teenage bullies might look back on their behaviour and cringe or feel very guilty and remorseful. And some won't, but hey-ho. But Scholar was talking about this, and she was talking about popularity and the idea of like thin privilege, or the concept of if you look a certain way, if you fit the body trend, then you're more automatically accepted. Whereas if you are in a larger body, you are dismissed more readily or not taken notice of. And Scholar goes on to talk about the idea of the popular kids and who made them popular and why are they popular. And this just sparks my imagination and my ideas. And in a different video, Madison Brown, the video essayist, talks about smarts versus beauty. The idea of which is more complemented. So in high school, smarts are of course valued on paper, and they are the things that will get you places depending on what you want to do, of course. But socially, it's very geared to beauty. There are a lot of stereotypes surrounding having one and not the other, and especially when you're socialised as female, it seems that you can only have one. If you're smart and you show that you're smart, then you're probably not going to get in with the popular crowd. Whereas if you're beautiful and perhaps fake a bit of ignorance, which links into the bimbo archetype, you can have access to that higher social ranking, being in the popular clique. So what is popular varies with the time in which we go to school. It was interesting. I was thinking about when did popularity become such a thing, but of course, generation after generation, there has always been the in crowd, whether it be the upper classes or the particular group with their manicures. And a lot of our archetypes, I feel, are inherited from America as well. A lot of stereotypes, a lot of aesthetics are very much inherited from America, and that links in especially in more modern times with social media and media in general. But how has this varied over time? I actually asked my mum about this, and these are sort of some things she said. So for boys, it was good-looking ones, they were confident, they were funny, and this kind of links into the idea of the rebel, the idea that the popular boys tend to be the ones who get in trouble a bit more, who are the class clowns. The popular girls, it was slimness. It was, interestingly, my mum said about the girls who got their female figure, meaning like their adults, their womanly figure, or their adult shape, early. And that was really interesting because, again, this links to the idea of teenagehood being adjacent to adulthood, and the more adult perhaps that you appear, the more authority you're given within that social sphere, because the more sure of yourself you seem, perhaps, or by having a more womanly figure, you're automatically seen as more dominant because you almost encapsulate the mother. You're not maternal, but you're seen as adult, you're seen as aspirational, when, for example, seen side by side with your favourite celebrities or your influencers who are in their 20s or older. And my mum also said about the girls who were trendy. And by being trendy, you perhaps have the financial ability to buy clothes and buy these things and be trendy. It's all very physical. My mum also talks about being good at PE, which is interesting. And I suppose in that way it's showing fitness, it's showing grace perhaps, and it's a very physical and it's a very visible way of showing your dominance perhaps within a social sphere. Whereas something like being good at math, again, it's adjacent to the nerd stereotype. It's also kind of slightly more covert dominance perhaps. My mum's talking about hiding cleverness to gain access to popularity if you're pretty enough, which again kind of repeats my own point that people perhaps will conceal their cleverness or even dumb themselves down, to use that phrase, to gain access to popularity. And this can have adverse effects. We're going to talk about the psychology in a minute. So the talk about these preconceived notions of what beauty represents. The idea that in the media, certain characters are given the pretty badge and therefore pigeonholed into that. And certain movies, like Legally Blonde, have sort of fought this expectation. Beauty intersects with class, and some must sell their beauty to get by or open doors. But the idea that beauty is a social cue. The drastic makeovers of especially the early 2000s films where the nerd becomes the beautiful model, or the slightly oddball becomes this gorgeous like model of femininity. The take also raises the point, and it's quite obvious really, but the beautiful actresses are made ugly, quote unquote, using glasses or a nerdy demeanour. The idea that the pretty girl is an enterprise, that if you go through the process and put in the work, then you too can access the wonders of sexuality and beauty. Men don't need to put in so much effort to be acceptable. Interestingly enough, beauty is also seen as a feared thing. So in ancient Greece, Socrates actually warned that a kiss from a pretty woman is deadlier than spider's venom. Wow. And this gives beauty an authority, perhaps, and almost an intimidation to it, which again links the idea of popularity. Because if you're intimidating, then you're automatically given a license to do things that you want, and you're given a license to be confident. and that in turn emphasises your presence and everyone knows who you are, that's what makes you popular. It's about everyone knowing who you are, not about how many friends you have, maybe. Popular people of lower years will also encapsulate popular people of higher years, or rather the people in the lower years will imitate the people in the later years, the older girls, the older boys, how they act, and they see them as the big people, the big names, they're popular. And so if you start to act like them or speak to them or maybe hang out with them, act a certain way, by proxy as well, things like siblings, they then automatically become the popular ones. But are you then hiding your true self to gain access to a particular social realm? Now, looking at the psychology of it, the popular kids, or who become the popular kids, tend to be very with it in the social scene. So nowadays that's going to be with social media. They might have a big social media account or maybe even presence. They're often the leaders in a lot of conversations. They're frequently extroverted as well, and they attract attention in this way, but through their confidence. With adults as well as with peers, so with teachers as well, and they're able to start conversations and that gets them noticed in class per se. So interestingly, psychologically, when children are in teenagehood, they are in that transition stage to adulthood, and so they begin to separate from their parents, and by separating from your parents it sort of removes a layer of protection perhaps, and this is what drives one towards wanting this higher status, because with higher status comes protection. Unfortunately though, with popularity there comes some negative. So to become popular or to retain your popular status or to be popular, these children tend to act out more. They tend to engage in behaviours to gain approval from their peers, and this means they are more likely to engage in higher risk activities like drugs and early consumption of alcohol, anti-authority behaviour. Everyone wants to be liked, and so it's natural to yearn for this popularity. And linking back to what my mum said and little other things, peers tend to describe popular kids as attractive, athletic, wealthy, nicely dressed, and interestingly not boring. In a Substack article, Parenthood 365, which seemed to be an advisory things for parents, but it was quite good. So said that there are two different types of popularity split between likability and status. They said that this correlates with age, which makes sense. So the idea that status becomes the more dominant signifier of popularity as you grow older, whereas likability is very much the essence of being popular when you're a really like a young child, because obviously if you're liked then people want to play with you more and things like that. So there's a couple of quotes here that I'm going to just read out. So oxytocin promotes a need to connect and bond with others. Dopamine activates the brain's pleasure center and is commonly associated with the high people feel from drugs. As a result, teens become almost addicted to any type of attention from their peers. Status is not a measure of how well a person is liked, but rather it reflects a person's visibility, dominance, and influence on the group. That's why the most popular students are sometimes widely disliked by their peers, even when those same peers seek to emulate them, which is really interesting because you do see that trend that while there may be the popular group, the popular kids, are they actually really liked by people, or are they looked at in a, when you're outside of that popular sphere, perhaps there is a hint of jealousy to that, but they're looked at, the popular kids are so awful or they're horrible, or I hate them, or I wouldn't want to be friends with them, I wouldn't want to be them. Yeah, there's a jealousy thing there, but then as this states, there is that psychological factor that perhaps means that popularity doesn't necessarily equate to likability. And Mitch Prinstein says, and a quote, that you can be very popular and have only a few people believe they are friends with you. So finally, in the last little section of this episode, I want to talk about the idea of the teenage dream. So Shanspeare, a YouTuber and video essayist, talks about how the teenagers that we see on our screens, and this dream that persists on our screens, the teenagers in media are heroes, romantic, infallible, unending. And Shanspeare goes on to talk about youth culture, that particularly... So during the 1950s, that was the rise of the teenager, perhaps as a label, and as they are currently, in the sense of them having their own identity. Because when you're growing, you're not necessarily you can't identify with the adults yet, but you're also too far from childhood to really feel like you can associate yourself with children. And interestingly enough, she goes on to talk about how marketing to teenagers has almost fed into the idea of being teenage, of teenagehood, of the teenage dream. The new marketing sector that can be created for this new audience, creating products to appeal to it. But most importantly, as I've said, it's a huge time for development, and it's a gap between being a child and being an adult. Your brains are still developing at this point. The hierarchies in high school, the cliques in high school, if you want to say it that way, are enforced by those around you, and you feel that while you're searching for yourself, you're very uncertain. You'll crave that belonging, and inherently, psychologically, humans will crave that connection. And so to feel like you belong in a particular group, that's ideal. You begin to emulate perhaps the characteristics of this group, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a popular kid to feel accepted, but that is one way in which people can do it, and it kind of depends which clique you naturally fall into. Everyone will have characteristics that overlap, because that is natural. That is how we find the people that we get on with, who become our closest friends throughout life. But particularly when you're a teenager and in school, you feel that maybe you have to fake some parts as well. And that can almost lead to a sense of disillusionment. You know, you're served this teenage dream, you're told that these are the best years of your life, that you should be happy and enjoying it and free, and you should have all these particular things and be at this particular developmental stage and know all these things about your life and do well in school. And it's a lot to deal with and a lot to take on alongside the turmoil of just navigating life. You're experiencing everything for the first time at this point, and you tend to, because your brain's still developing, make decisions on emotion and not logic, which would convey you to act in a certain way that maybe you wouldn't do otherwise. Sort of angst and confusion. And Shanspeare talks about how you have adult actors playing teenagers on TV, which again I think impresses this idea of having to grow up super quickly, or being aspirational towards looking like or being like these characters who are presented to you as representations of your age, but they are not. They are adults playing children, and they're inherently going to bring a higher level of maturity, and they're of course going to look more mature than one would be typically at that age. Shanspeare coins it as the teenage dream industrial complex. Companies market to particular goals, particular desires, that you should have had your first relationship by this age. And importantly, if you're unable to access certain things yourself, perhaps you haven't had a relationship by this given miraculous age or things like that, then you can consume that, you can absorb that through the media that you watch. And so it's constantly fed to you this idea of what you should be, and you're not good enough if you haven't done it yet. Importantly, Shanspeare also talks about the rising rates of mental health conditions in teenagers, and also the suicide rate. We should be doing more to look after this demographic. And that's the end of the episode. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope it was okay. I feel I'm talking quite quietly right now. But for some reason I feel not embarrassed. Embarrassed isn't the right word, but I feel very aware that there's like other people in. So I'm quite I'm keeping my voice low, and I feel like it kind of, I guess I'm a bit embarrassed in a sense because I'm just talking to myself. And also it's unedited, so, you know, unpresentable. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. Let me know what you think. It's a bit of a left field one, trying to do these more like zoomed in sorts of things, and I'm still looking at doing video content as well. Fun. So yeah, I say so much, it's actually embarrassing. Oh my god, not embarrassing again. See, I'm repeating myself. It's a bad time. Thank you so much for listening, and take care. Let's keep talking.